weary soul. And of course, Claudia says, is that about you? And of course it's about me. It's like, yes, I said all of that, too, to bring you up to date. And I know, as I look around here, you know, I hate to say it this way, but we're kind of at that point, most of us in our lives, where it's inevitable. I'm looking at Joshua because he's not at that point in his life, but it's kind of inevitable that the people you love, you know, they just are struggling. There's so many here. We know so many people in our lives that are dealing with cancer now and disease and struggles. Just chaos in the world that seems to just keep pushing down. And I'm looking at this letter that Paul writes to Gaius. It's 3 John, and I'm wondering, what is this letter doing here? Is it just because he wrote 3 letters and it's a set and we got to put them in here? Because it really doesn't make sense that this letter would be here. It's a very short letter. It's a personal letter. And yet but I understand that whatever's here, number one, the church kept it. So they felt it was important. And 2, God puts this here for us so that we can learn from it. And so, just so I say all this so you guys can appreciate where I'm coming from as I present this short little letter here from 3 John, and put it in its context so you could see rest for a weary soul. You know, I had mentioned this earlier that Matthew 11, 29 and 30, they seem like an odd passage in Scripture, like so many things are. Jesus says, take my yoke upon you. Wait, well, what's a yoke? Do you know what a yoke is? I know you do because you're old. A yoke is that wooden truss that you harness. A lot of times it was the ox, but it was used for other types of animals. You yoke them together to do work. Jesus says, take my yoke. It's a yoke upon you, and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. It seems odd. The next verse says, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Did Jesus, as God in the flesh, as we talked about this morning, did he have a burden to carry? Wow. Now, I'll say this at the beginning, and we'll see if it fits at the end. Aligning our actions with God's purpose is a way to have rest for a weary soul. So I'll say it again. Aligning our actions with God's purpose. It always, over the years, since I started out here many years ago and was baptized here, that was very assuring to know that God has a plan and purpose for our lives. I don't claim to understand all of it, but it gives me great peace to know that there's a plan and purpose, because, of course, at the time when I said, all right, I need to do something, I need to change my life, things were going pretty good for me. I did well. I did all the things that you say, you work hard, you can have anything that you want. Boy, I just proved that. That was a piece of cake. I worked up in a business. I happened to be at the right place at the right time, you could argue, but it was like, people were throwing money at me, and I got to travel around. I got all my friends are in college, spending money, and I'm making money, taking them out on weekends, and yet I got to a point about 10, 15 years into business, and I was like, I got all this money, I got nothing to show for it. Is this what life's all about? I have nice things, but I'm still the same person. And I mentioned that song, Man, How Did I Get Here? As the days go by, as this Talking Head song going on, I look back, and I'm like, wow. And then I have people really keeping me up at night telling me things. Well, if you don't change what you're doing, the next 5 years are going to look like the last 5 years, and ain't that depressing? And I'm like, yeah, that pretty much is. I'm like, what am I doing? And so I just found comfort that God has a purpose for me. Even though I don't understand, I'm going to trust him because I know that what I'm doing is not going very well. As I study from Jesus and I learn from him, it was a scene where he's, in John chapter 4, you know the scene, he's at the woman at the well, and she comes and her life is just a mess. And Jesus has this conversation with her, and he's talking about this, the water that will well up in you, and you won't thirst anymore. And it's just, however you want to say it, happens this way, but symbolically, she leaves what she came to the well for. She leaves her water pot, and she goes into town. Was she excited? Do you think when she went out in the heat of the day with that water pot that she was in a very good mood? That she had to go in the heat of the day because she wasn't going out with the rest of the women in the morning, which would be tradition. And then she meets Jesus, and that doesn't look like a good situation at the beginning. She ends up leaving what she came for and going back excited. I've said this before, we know this intellectually, we know this, we can change our attitude in a flash under the right circumstances. I'm miserable and Tom, you just won $1 million, and I hear my name, I'm like, woo, all of a sudden life's not so bad anymore, because I hit the jackpot. And it's amazing how my attitude can just turn around. In this letter, 3 John, do you know who John is? He's the apostle of love. Really? Remember, he was one of the sons of thunder. We often pick on Peter because Peter's always like out in front saying stuff, and I've been saying for weeks now, if you say something, you're going to get ridiculed. You're just up for grabs. But John, at this time, when he writes this, he's known as the apostle of love. And he writes this personal letter to Gaius as his elder. But let's just look at what his message to him is. He starts out, if you go back, Joshua read 5 through 8, but just go back to verse 4. He says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. He's talking about Gaius. No greater joy that my children. John has joy in communicating with Gaius. And he says, and beloved, verse 5, beloved, it's such an endearing term. Beloved, and this is ESV, it sounds a little different than the New King James, but it is a faithful thing you do in all your efforts for these brothers, strangers as they are. What they are traveling missionary preachers, maybe itinerant preachers. They're missionaries, but they're preachers, teachers. And they're traveling at a time where it's pretty perilous in the Roman Empire to be out there. And John is commending Gaius, and he's praying for Gaius. We're going to get to this, but he's praying that Gaius prosper so he can continue to be generous and supply the needs of these sojourners that are out there for the sake of the gospel. But I want us to look at the first thing. Thank you, Linda. Linda's here. So the first thing, it's 3 John 5 through 8, and there's no easy memory thing with this. I'm just going to give you, it's just a formula of finding rest for a weary soul. and it seems unusual, the first thing in verse 8 is faithful efforts. How can I'm tired, I'm exhausted, and the answer is to work, to put in more effort. Let me say, when Jesus' disciples returned after that scene with the woman in the well, and they said, "What, Jesus, did you eat?" And he says, my food is to do the will of him who sent me to accomplish his work. Right? Where did you get food? My food is to do the will of him who sent me to accomplish his work. It's John 4:34 where Jesus says that. And what was he saying there? This woman comes to him. He knows the woman's situation, but when she leaves, how does she leave? We know the rest of the story. She doesn't just go into town. She stirs up the whole town. And while Jesus is talking to his disciples, the crowd starts coming out of the town. I mean, are you worried about your stomach? Are you worried about your stomach at this point? Attitude. Wow. Yes, we have to eat. Don't misunderstand. But the first key in this formula of finding rest for our soul is faithful efforts. He's commending Gaius to take care of these brothers. Now, verse 6 says, who testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God. Our motivation here in this formula is the love of God. It's to appreciate. I'm not going to go through and these words, and they're powerful words. How this sentence is kind of formatted in the Greek, it could mean many, many different things. You are to be like God in your giving. You are to be like God in your going, or they're like God in their going because of what you gave them. So it's kind of neat how that plays out. Bless you. But I want to see here, faithful efforts, our motivation is from the love of God, and this is the apostle of love. Keep this in mind, because this is going to come back. The apostle of love is presenting this, and so of course this love theme is throughout. So you send them in a manner worthy of God, and verse 7, for they have gone out for the sake of the name. Obviously they're for Jesus, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. So in other words, their support system is coming from the church. The church needs to acknowledge them and participate in them as they go and honor such who do such things, which is what John's saying. They've gone out for the sake of the name. They're not getting their sustenance from anywhere else. So we have our faithful efforts, we have our motivation. We should be motivated by the love of God, and now we have the sake of the name. It's the standard of Jesus, that we have Jesus in our lives, and we reorient our lives around that standard for the sake of his name. I'm reminded of Matthew 6:33, and it's the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus is telling them, don't be anxious about anything. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. All these things will be added to you. God knows that you need them. Can we trust God to supply us with the things that we need? He says he will, but we want to see that standard for the sake of his name. And then we ought to support, verse 8, we ought to support people like these, that we may be fellow workers for the truth. So in other words, we are sharing in this ministry because we can't all do what all of us can do. We all have different roles, right? Different parts to play, but we can share in it together. We can be there when they come through and support them and pray with them and encourage and let them know that we're learning. Doesn't that excite you to see brothers and sisters? And thank you, Bradley, for reading from Ephesians chapter 4 this morning to remind us, because we mentioned a little bit in the study earlier about being renewed in our minds. How is this giving us rest from a weary soul? Because the works that the world does, the wages of sin, the sinful stuff, is death. If we want rest for our soul, we need to renew our thinking in our minds, our attitude about things, so that we can handle situations so they don't overwhelm us. I'm not saying troubles are going away. I'm saying Paul starts out the second letter of Corinthians talking about the God of all comfort. And how is Paul able to comfort people? Because he's been overwhelmed with so much. I know Claudia gets on me, and believe me, I'm not trying to be Paul. I understand. I read Paul, and not many people can hang with that guy. He was so intense. I think, praise Luke, right? Mark, Barnabas, Timothy. Paul's not an easy man to travel with. Some of them couldn't put up with him. Even Barnabas, they had to separate for a while, and they came back. But he's intense. But he's like, we're crushed down all the time. Why? So we can comfort you and build you up. So I'm not saying that situations are going to get better in our lives. I'm going to say we can get better at handling them. We can get better at sharing with our brothers and sisters to help build them up. And so, okay, now let's just take a look at this apostle of love writing this letter to Gaius. Let's go back to the top, to the elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in the truth. And John's first two letters, he makes this contrast. Love of the world is enmity with God. There's good and evil. You got to discern between good and evil. He's commending Gaius as an elder to Gaius and saying, I love you in the truth. Beloved, I pray, verse 2, I pray that all may go well with you, and that you may be in good health as it goes well with your soul. Paul wants Gaius is probably pretty well off to be able to house a large group of Christians, maybe have church in his house, but to entertain these. He says, for I rejoice greatly when the brothers came and testified to your truth, as indeed you are walking in the truth. Now it seems to me this probably is Demetrius, which we're going to see, who comes and lets John know what's going on. And it prompts John to write this letter. And so we drop down to verse 9, and we have this beautiful encouragement from John to Gaius. But look what it's in the midst of. Starting in verse 9, I have written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. So if I come, I will bring up what he is doing, talking wicked nonsense against us. And not content with that, he refuses to welcome the brothers, probably these brothers that are traveling through, and also stops those who want to and puts them out of the church. Beloved, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. Whoever does good is from God. Whoever does evil has not seen God. And then here's Demetrius in verse 12. So Demetrius has received a good testimony from everyone, and from the truth itself, we also add our testimony, and you know that our testimony is true. And here's what just kind of grabs my heart about John. I have much more to write to you about, but I would rather not write in pen and ink because I want to see you face to face, because I want to communicate with you. It's a really short letter. And here's my point. John is an apostle. He's known at this time as the apostle of love. And John, if you just look at the encouragement that comes from this letter, you might overlook the circumstances. And it came out in our study this morning. Jesus is having this conflict in John. It started in, probably before this, but John chapter 6, and now we're in John chapter 8. And Jesus, he has these confrontations as he went up to the Passover, and then he retreats. He goes to the Mount of Olives, comes back early in the morning. They're sitting around. It's quiet. It's calm. And they bring this screaming woman in the midst of them and just bring chaos into this nice, quiet time with Jesus. And they're trying to stir him up and trying to get him to react emotionally. And that's our life in the world as Christians. That we're trying to live a quiet life. We're trying to love God and love our brothers and sisters. But this world is this chaos out there trying to pull us into it and get us. And I'm not saying, and Bradley rightly brought this up, I'm not saying we're going to eliminate emotions. That's not the point. We have emotions and we need to exercise our emotions. But what I want us to see is Jesus was an example, and I like Derek's point this morning too, that if we could just take a moment and not react to what we initially perceived, but just kind of gather ourselves. That's not always possible, right? I mean, if we get in a situation where we're just energized, then we only can just respond. But I'm saying we can work on ourselves and renew our minds and understand that the world is a fallen place. And most of what's going on in the world is not malicious in their mind or even bad. It's just a result of the circumstances we find ourselves in. But here, John can write this letter, and I imagine with a smile on his face, verse 4, no greater joy than I have than seeing my children walking in truth. In the midst of something that seems awful. And it's not unusual. And sometimes maybe it's our circumstances in our life where we can read into scripture like this, where when we were going through Revelation, when Jesus addresses the churches, in Revelation, the 7 churches, it's Revelation chapter 2. I'm just going to point out a couple of verses. It was just an observation that kind of hit me that, and hopefully it'll make sense when I use the example out of Philippians. In Revelation 2:9, as Jesus addressed the churches, each one, he says, here's what I like about you, here's what you're doing wrong, repent of those things. In verse 9, he says, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. So Jesus is saying those Jews who haven't accepted him, they're not following God. And that's tough. In that time, we want to put out the welcome mat. Oh, you're a Jew. Come on in. We want to learn from you. And he's saying don't receive them. In verse 15, so you also have some who hold the teaching of the Nicolaitans. There was obviously Nicholas is doing something, in my mind, and he's drawing people away, and they're not following Jesus. They're following Nicholas, and they become the Nicolaitans. In verse 20, Revelation 2:20, but I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and teaching and seducing my servants to practice sexual immorality and to eat food sacrificed to idols. In 3:4, for Sardis, he says, yet you still have a few names in Sardis, people who have not soiled their garments, and they will walk with me in white, for they are worthy. When we were going through these letters, I want to point out, just like 3 John shows us, that a lot of the problems that are going on here are coming from the leadership. And Jesus is saying, that's not an excuse. To Sardis, that's pretty harsh, that you have leaders that are not great leaders. I've always said here, for this congregation, I'm blessed to be here because we don't have malicious leaders. And we have to work on that, right? That we don't fall into this trap of Paul, when he prays with the Ephesian elders, and he says, the wolves are coming from you. Elders. John's writing to Gaius, and Diotrephes is a leader in this church, and he's not accepting these people, and John's encouraging a member. Like Jesus, I think, when he says, there are some of you there that haven't soiled your garments. How about this? And we take this many different ways, but Philippians 2:12, it's a verse that we know, and we like, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Whoops, I just had it. So, he was just saying how Jesus gave up his glory in chapter 2:5, right? And he emptied himself. And then now it's every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord to the glory of God the Father. Therefore, Philippians 2:12, my beloved, as you've always obeyed, so now not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. In other words, we're all on this path, we're all on this journey, and we need to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. But in the context of what Paul was writing to the Philippians, he was saying, you guys come together and work it out together. Individually, we still need to make the changes. But collectively, as Bradley read for us this morning, that congregational setting where we edify one another, we build one another up to help each other to stay on that path, to continue that journey in the midst of things that seem to be going awry. And sometimes when we're trouble, I mention this a lot to you guys. I just want to be open with you. I'm sad right now. There's just a lot of stuff going on. At the same time, I'm thoroughly excited. I see Marion comes in and she lights up my world like Jackie does. And not to say the rest of you don't. I'm just saying when there's something about, I know as an older person now, when I see a younger person full of the Spirit and excited, I get energized. It gives me great hope for the future. But I also, when I see older people that have had a lot of life experiences and they're smiling, it gives me hope that I'll smile again. I'm sad. There are things going on that maybe I didn't handle them so well. I'm working it out. And I know I'll get over it. I know because I've been through it before. And one of the things I want you guys to consider, I mentioned it this morning in our class. I think one of the things that helped me yesterday when I was looking at, most of what I got out of this is there's so many myths. It reminded me of the lies we believe. There are so many, but some of them were real eye-openers to me about processing grief. And there were things I knew intuitively, but until you see somebody kind of organize it, I say, oh yeah, that makes sense. Now it makes sense to me. Rest. Rest comes from, if we can change some of the things in our lives and change our associations, so the things that are pressing down on us, I'm not saying ignore it or deny it's there. I mean, I know our circumstances are tough, but God wants us to take on His yoke. And in the midst of the sorrow that I feel, I'm so excited of what's going on and what I'm seeing. And so as people, your brother Ron is just such an inspiration to me. we're missing some folks here today that have just been coming alive. Your sister Mary, the other Mary, not that this one isn't as, but Mary, for years, I just took for granted some of the things that Mary was just always here, but she was always teaching or doing other things. And Mary's now, almost like Ron, she's in almost every study with me. She's so excited to see what she's learning. And I said, Mary, we went through this stuff. She goes, I wasn't here. she goes, now I'm seeing this. And oh my goodness, the joy that comes out of that. So the renewing of our minds. I thank you guys again. Jordan mentioned to me this week, he says, well, you seem like you pray for everybody and people aren't praying for you. And I appreciate that, brother. Well, a lot of people are praying for me and for this congregation and for the school here. And so there's so many good things. I don't want to miss the good things because, I've got some struggles in my life. And I just thank you guys for always being there, right? And for showing that love. I want us to see that this morning we mentioned Jesus. Jesus was living in a world where just about, we can't imagine this, but where everybody's against him. They don't know for sure who he is. He knows for sure who he is. Do you know how amazing that is to try and tell people you're God, you have all these signs with you without sounding like a complete lunatic? Just like you, when you come to the truth and you try to tell somebody and like, what are you drinking, right? But that was Jesus' entire life, was knowing and not being able to really communicate. I mean, who's he talking to? We take this for granted, but we have this wonderful family here. And God's appeal is that your life's not going to get easier when you come into God's kingdom, God's economy. But you can change your perspective. And you can start identifying with God's love, that he loved the world so much that he was patient with an obnoxious person like me, who I know you guys still think I'm obnoxious, and that's okay. But can take our lives and turn them around. The circumstances don't change, but our attitudes can change. I had a great lesson. I shared it with you. It's not the winds we pray to change. It's the set of the sail. I'm in the process of setting my sail again. And let me just give you this little wisdom that I picked up. I learned a long time ago that if I want to do things, I got to learn. What's my computer frustrated me? Who hasn't wanted to smash it? And eventually I said, I got to learn how to fix this thing or I'm just going to be forever frustrated. But that lesson is translated so many times in my life that I've gotten advice and the advice is wrong. The experts are telling us this or that. And I'll tell you, yesterday was a real eye-opener for me. I'm going to bring some material that if anybody's interested, I could share it with you just on the surface. I'm going to be communicating with the presenter, but that has helped me so much. That we get advice and we think we're doing the right thing and then we find out, it's not the right thing. Keep an open mind and let's continue to gather together and absorb the love of God through his word. If you're not part of the kingdom, that's this song, again, always gets me, this invitation song. But the invitation's always available. I would ask the closing prayer today, again, please.